Hello everybody. Tonight is our first night of Ruby on Rails, and one of the first things that we really need to get accomplished is we have to get the software tools installed that are necessary for being successful in this course. I'm going to take us to Unit 1 here, and in Unit 1 I'm going to kind of introduce us to some resources that are pretty critical. So where I'm going to start is in this section here where I have a link to a number of different sites. And I'm going to give you a disclaimer right now. I have not tested these links since the last time I taught this course, which was a year ago. So if they do not work, I will be dynamically adjusting the links as I record the video, so you see that I am human also. And also, like my students, sometimes wait till the last minute to do things. But that's, as long as we get it to work, that's really the key part. All right, so one thing that's really critical here is that we understand that Ruby on Rails really is a combination of several technologies. The key ones, of course, being the Ruby programming language and then the Rails web development framework, which works on top of Ruby. So really the prerequisite for doing Rails, and if you guys haven't noticed, that's really the technology that we're using here, thus the name of your book, is the fact that we must have the Ruby programming language present on the machine. So we're going to start by visiting this very first link here, and I would encourage you guys to do the same. And this takes us to the parent site of the Ruby language. Now, as we look at this, I want you guys to notice that here's actually kind of a go-to spot for getting information about this language. The fact that this is an open source programming language indicates to you that it is constantly undergoing change. And any of the changes that happen, any of the versions that you might want to use, any of the additional tools that you might want to get for working with the language, and even the community support is typically mostly found on this site. Doesn't mean that there's not other good sites to get information. So for example, if you run into problems with Ruby or Rails and you do some searches on how to solve a problem, very good chance you'll end up like on Stack Overflow, for example. And that's perfectly fine. But you should know that this is here for a lot of different reasons. One of them is the fact that this is where you come to download the product. Now, I'm working on a PC right now, and all the examples I'm going to have for this course will be PC-centric. However, this is a technology, because of its open source nature, did really originate on a Linux platform, and therefore runs well in basically all versions of Linux, the Mac OS, which is basically a Unix operating system as well, and then it's been ported to work on Windows. And the intent with these languages, because they are what we call interpreted languages, they're not compiled languages, is that you run all the commands either from files that operate the command line or from the command line directly. And what they've done with Ruby and Rails is made the command line commands identical on all platforms. The only thing that's really different is the prompt that you're looking for. So if you work on a Mac system or a Linux system, your prompt will typically be the bash shell, which is the born-again command line shell, where the prompt is a $sign. And if you're on a PC, you either have like a C prompt or a D prompt or something like that. How familiar you are with the command prompt, frankly, is fairly irrelevant, because I will teach you the stuff that you need to know to be successful in here. And you don't have to do your work exclusively from the prompt. If you have a familiarity already with the prompt, that's great, because that'll give you a little bit of a leg up, but the truth is you should not be intimidated. Command prompt is just a way to tell a computer to do something. The reality is as you become a power user, you begin to realize there's things you can do from a prompt that you could never do from a graphical interface, which is very appealing, frankly, to people that want to do high-level IT work. All right. That aside, let's take a look really quickly at some of the stuff that you see on the screen just from landing on, above the fold on this site, which is they have a little example of what the language looks like. Now, it doesn't really take very much if you've done other languages to look at this and very quickly go, oh, yeah, I kind of get it, right? This looks like an array. This looks like a variable. And you probably can guess what puts does. That's kind of like an echo command in PHP, or a write line or a print line, or any of those types of commands. It's a very intuitive language, and I always tell students very often what's scary about this language is sometimes you can guess what the command would be, and you're probably right, which is pretty weird. So whoever was writing the language is like, well, maybe we should, call this what it is, and put the command up there. And if you don't know, of course, you can come to this site or a host of other sites and actually learn what the proper commands are. So the full documentation is available here as well. The thing that we do want to do, though, and actually I'm going to bop back over um, here, is there are a number of different sites here, and I do want to make you understand very clearly that Ruby is not Rails. Rails is the framework that sits on top of it. So Ruby on Rails as a language has its own official site, which we're going to look at in just a little bit. But our first step is to get this downloaded and installed. The thing that I will tell you, though, is that there are different ways to install this. My approach is to do a direct operating system install. Okay, so in other words, I'm going to install the programming language, then I'm going to install the framework. They're going to operate directly inside of Windows. There is alternative approaches, and some of which you'll see a little farther down in the course shell here. In fact, I have all these install instructions, and then down here, there's actually this packaged installer, which some students opt to use. And what that does is it actually gives you the tools, but it creates for you actually a separate command shell that basically mimics a Linux environment. So you actually get a bash shell. It's integrated with GitHub, and you get a $ prompt. And some people opt to do this because they find that it's easier to do the install. All right. That's completely up to you. Feel free to experiment. In fact, if you have multiple machines or virtual environments you can play with, go for it. The one that sits right below this listing here, the cloud-based IDE, I was just showing to my students here in class. When I was first looking at this, in fact, last time I taught this last fall of 2017, the cloud-based IDE was out there, and since then, Amazon has snatched them up and made it part of their AWS platform. But that basically means it's not free anymore. But it's something you might want to explore if you're curious. So in that environment, what's really useful is that everything is pre-configured. There's nothing to install. You have a complete online-based IDE, command prompt, and development platform, all integrated. And what was the price? Like $2, $2 a month, basically, which really is kind of a steal. I was kind of hoping it was bundled with my Prime account, and maybe it is. I guess I haven't looked that deeply into it. All right, back over to the Ruby site. Let's go ahead and hit the download Ruby button. And now when we get to this page, I want to point out a couple things before we go digging to the download. The one thing is when you work with these open source technologies, you always want to be very aware of what versions you're working with and what is considered stable. Because you can see right in that first paragraph there, they say the current stable version is 2.5.1. That does not mean that they won't have more modern versions out there, but I would always caution you, especially when you're doing any development work that you plan to deploy out in the field, you shouldn't work with the cutting edge versions because frankly, they're not considered stable yet and they could have issues. Now, chances are that they'll probably be stable with the core technologies, but do you really want to take that chance if you're doing something that you're driving a whole business structure on? Probably not. Do you want to do that while you're learning and some commands might not work the way you want? Probably not. So you can see why you might want to, stay with the stable versions. The other thing that you should explore here is notice this Get Started section up here on top. They have right on this site a number of different tutorials, some of which we're going to explore, and they're pretty good. Now, I think the last time I tried, I think this Ruby in 20 minutes, it took me a lot longer than 20 minutes. So just so you know, don't expect that it will necessarily go that fast, especially if you're trying to learn. But I do find that they have this other site here, moving to Ruby and comparing it to other languages. So what they have here is a list of arguably what are some of the more popular development languages out there, and some of the old school languages like C and Perl. And when I first started working in web, if we were doing server-side scripting, we were using Perl, right? That was like one of the first back-end languages, and then it kind of moved over to PHP and other languages later. Um, but if you know these languages, here's a guide. So like all of you here at Gateway are required to take both Java and PHP. And then by virtue of taking your .NET classes, you end up learning C#, which is similar to Java, and it's also similar to C and C++, more like C++ really. But um, so if you're moving from languages like that to this new language, there's a basis of comparison that you should definitely check out. All right, I'm going to go back a page here because really our goal here is to do some downloading. And you should always, as a person venturing into these realms, so to speak, be really careful about reading. Be really careful about reading because notice this isn't like Microsoft product, where they just say download here, click the installer, good, you're all set. Not like that, folks. There's a little bit more to it, and sometimes the devil is in the detail, or the solution is in the detail. And frankly, you want to make sure that you read the instructions carefully. So notice they don't have like a big install button or something like that, at least not on this page. But they want you to look at the version that you're working with. And yes, it works on all platforms. And what are we working with? We're working with Windows. So we're going to click on the Ruby installer page to take us there. Now, I do have a link that takes us right to this page right here. So wherever it says download Rails and Ruby, I believe that's direct to this particular link. So this is the Ruby installer, and I'm going to go ahead and actually click on the download button, and you will see that it doesn't initiate a download right away because you have more choices to make. What we are looking at here is a combination of things, right? So they told us that the latest stable release was what? 2.51, I think it was, right? Now, here, we're going to be doing development, right? So we might probably want the development kit. Okay, that's a yes. Okay. So now when you look at the development kit, you'll notice that they have one highlighted with a pointer on it. And in the past, this is kind of interesting, is they would not do that. They wouldn't highlight it like that. But if you were one of those people that actually took the time to read, you would read the sidebar, and if you read the sidebar up here, it says if you don't know what version to install and you're getting started with Ruby, we recommend you use the 2.4x version, not 2.5. Isn't that interesting? Now, Richard, you said what version is on the school machines here? 2.4.4. So my inclination is that's probably the version we're going to go with. When that was installed, in fact, the techs, when they were creating the images for the classroom machines, I actually sat with the tech to install it, because he's like, I've never done Ruby before, So I went down and we sat down and they kind of adjusted my instructions to go with. So that is what we're going to do. We're going to shoot for the 2.4.4 version that they have highlighted, and I recommend that you guys do the same. Okay. So the fascinating thing is, in previous iterations, and I know last year this wasn't the case, but maybe the year before that, you would actually have to install the development kit separately from the language. The fact that they have them bundled is good. Notice, though, that you can actually step back through their archives and get legacy versions if you're working on a legacy project. So that is something that's really good to know, because often when you go out into the field and you get a job, working this stuff, a lot of times they won't put you on the new stuff right away. They'll put you on fixing old stuff. so you might have to know how to do this. All right. All right. They also give you a couple little notes here in the sidebar. You know, which development kit to use and all that. And I want you to notice that there's also a secondary tool that we're going to be installing. And I remember from experience, there are some quirky little issues with the install. Like I said, this isn't like your typical Windows software. And I want you guys to follow along with me. And if you do get stuck on your own doing the installs, remember you can always reach out to me and we can discuss these things and I can help you with it. All right, so now that we have that downloaded, why don't you go ahead and give that a click and let's launch it to install. Now, I have to tell you that I already have Ruby installed on my machine. Okay. I think my typical pattern for this is if I really wanted to be safe, I would uninstall the previous version and then install the new version. I'm being brave right now, and I'm just going to install and see what happens. I don't know if that's really a good idea, so I'm giving you a disclaimer up front that I might be like stepping back and redoing this in a few minutes, right? But I'm entering into it intelligently, knowing that, and I'm telling you guys that up front so you can't go, look, even the teacher screws up. Well, you know what, guys? This is how you learn about, okay, so I'll come away with a piece of knowledge here, which is I can install 2.44 in place right over 2.42, and I'll know that piece of information for the future. And if it doesn't work, I will know that I have to uninstall first, and I'm not going to go into panic mode. I'm being anticipatory, right? And it's okay because it's IT, and we're not destroying a darn thing, right? Just little electrons on my hard drive. All right, so I'm going to accept the license agreement and click next. And then you'll notice that automatically you have to install Ruby, obviously, but then you have this secondary tool, the MSys2, which we do want on there as well. So go ahead and click next. And did you notice the screen that just popped up? What did it do first? It uninstalled the previous version for me. So that question has been answered. Now this isn't a really huge download because it's basically a programming language. So there are a bunch of executables, but there's also just really a bunch of little code files that are coming down with the language. I don't know if you're able to read all the little path statements and files that are popping up there, but I'm kind of a geek, so I actually kind of look at those things and I notice there's lots of DLL files, there's lots of code files, lots of little exe files, including, if you just noticed, all the documentation follows Ruby onto your machine. One thing that I often do when I do the install for these things is sometimes I skip the documentation part. And when we get to do the Rails install, that's kind of a standard thing I do. Just simply because, the truth is if I'm looking something up, I probably go to the browser first and don't even think about looking on my hard drive, so why waste the space? Just kind of my thinking. So also makes the install much faster. All right, we see that it's nearing completion. Your machine might take a little longer or it might be a little faster if you have something more modern. This is all SSD, 16 gigs of RAM, and an i7, so. And SATA hard drive too, that helps. All right, so go ahead and notice here that, see where my pointer is right now? It says run the MSys install thing. So leave that checked and click finish. All right. Now I'm trying to remember, and I've done this many times, and I always forget which of these I should choose in terms of selection. And what I'm actually going to do, folks, is I'm going to jump over to my install instructions, which are in the Unit 1 folder. And I will give you the disclaimer clearly that the version numbers are going to change, so I'm going to edit those probably by the time you see this video. Those will be edited as well. We've run the Ruby installer, but now see how I have this little note here in step number 5? And I'm glad I wrote that down because it's option 3 we want. And I'm going to tell you this, this MSys2 thing, I think is really quirky and can lead to confusion. But don't let it throw you. All right, so I'm going to choose option 3. And very much in a command line fashion, is doing a bunch of install stuff. Just let it do its work. Shouldn't take too long. And right now, I'm not sure if it's still continuing or if it's done. My assumption is it's still continuing. Yeah, well, and you can see that from the last line that hit the screen. You know, these aren't messages that they throw up there to make people think you're a hacker. Like in the movies, these are actually messages of like what's going on in the background in a very verbose fashion. And now you can see that we've actually completed, and now we're back to the original menu, right? Which means we're done and we're successful. And you notice that this last message here said succeeded, right? Which at this point means I can quit this. Now, they didn't write into the application and exit. Yeah, you could do that too, or you can just hit the X. That works too. Yeah, Control C is like kind of like a command line default for applications that are continuously running. And in fact, Nathan, I'm glad you brought that up because one thing that we'll do when we run Ruby on Rails applications is we'll get the web server running, and sometimes you need to stop the server and restart it, and Control C is the command line combo to do that. All right. Now, I noticed that step number 4, and I don't know if you guys noticed this, I wasn't even asked to do file associations, but this is sometimes a critical step. And what I'm going to have you guys do with me right now is actually check to see if the Ruby path statements were added to our environment variables. Now, some of you may have never even heard of what a path statement is, but long story short, when you run things from a command line, in order to run an executable file, you have to navigate to a folder. So like think about like a program being inside of a folder, and you have to like go through your file explorer and get to that folder and find the file and then double click it to run it, right? What a path statement does is it allows you to put a path into an application that's commonly used so that you don't have to, through the command line, navigate to that location and then type the command, that you can actually type the command to launch the application from any folder. So that's what I'm going to check right now. The quick way to do that in Windows is to bring up your file explorer, so bring up a new instance of that, and then right-click this PC or my computer, depending on what version of Windows you're using. I'm assuming Windows 10 at this point for most of you. Right-click this PC and choose Properties. That should bring up this interface. And then from there, we go to Advanced System Settings in the left sidebar. In this dialog, there's a little button here under the Advanced tab called Environment Variables. Click on that. Then you'll notice that the top box has a variable for a path statement. Now, a path statement is kind of an old school computer construct that was pretty common. Like you'd install an application. Let's say you'd install, WordPerfect back in the old days, and you wanted to run the application. You would have a path statement to WordPerfect, and you just type the WP command, and then the application would come up. And the reason for that is yes, folks, we're doing a lot of command line work, so having Ruby in that path is pretty important. So what you do is you click on that, highlight it, and then click Edit, and then you guys are noticing Are you noticing that I have a Ruby path statement here? I don't. So either the dialog failed to tell me that, um, or perhaps it's down here. Because you notice here, these are user variables, just for me, and the bottom box is system variables. So if it's not under my personal user account, it might be under the system account, which is where it should be. So down here I'm clicking on path, and then I'm clicking on edit. And then what that does is it allows me to see all the different things that are automatically in the path statement. Yes, you can make this window a little bigger if that helps. And what I'm looking for are paths to Ruby, and I am not seeing them, which gives me some concern. Okay, because we might actually have to add those in manually, and we'll find out if that's the case. So the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this particular line here with his path extensions, which shows you which files are automatically associated with certain applications. And I'm once again noticing that those aren't in there. Now, when you guys did your install, let me ask both of you, did you see a spot where it asked you to include it in the path? No, I didn't either. It does. But you started out with an install that did not have the path already there. Mine started out with a pre-existing install, and it told me it uninstalled, so maybe it uninstalled that too. Right. So I'm going to find out the hard way here, and really my temptation at this point is to reboot the machine to see if the path got updated. But there's a better way. Because even though it's not stored there, doesn't mean that the system didn't do something in the background that didn't register yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically jumping down to step number 7 right now. So step number 6 says launch a command prompt, and I'm assuming that some of you have done that already, and if not, go ahead and go to your start menu. Maybe I should just do that process manually for those of you that aren't familiar. And just type CMD, which brings up a command prompt. Go ahead and click on that, and then it brings up this window. And then all you have to do to see if Ruby is installed is type Ruby space -v. Lowercase is fine. And you see what it's doing for me. Right. And that's a clear indicator that your path statement has not stuck. All right. So here's what's going to happen. This video is rolling right now, but in order for me to check this and make sure that it installed correctly, I am going to reboot. And then that means, of course, I have to stop recording the video and I have to reinitiate. So this video will end here right now, and there'll be a part 2 shortly.